Testing. Are we ready?
Recording in progress.
Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to our work session. Today is Tuesday, September 20th. Board members present in the boardroom. We have members Lessons, Jacobs, Holloman, Higgins, and Bellamy. Joining us online, we have members Wilson and Donnelly. In addition, we have our superintendent, Dr. Jarrett Bryant, and our executive assistant, Amanda Foster, along with several of our wonderful staff, administrative staff. So with that, we will go to item B on our agenda, which is our request for information. And from my recollection, we have answered all of the questions that are in the queue that we had in our queue, except for those that we knew we would be getting to at specific points in time. So the budget questions are all there still, but we are slowly chipping away at the budget questions. Member Higgins had a question that we're going to deal with in December when we do our goal monitoring for, I can't remember exactly what it was, but we have a plan to deal with every item. And Member Jacobs, I just want to circle back to you to make sure we answered all of I know we answered two of them, but you had two others, and I think they were both answered in Board Connect or by Janet directly.
Yeah, thank you, Madam President. All my requests are complete as far as I'm concerned at this time.
Okay. So at this time, are there other requests? Yes, Member Lessons.
Yeah, maybe 6 weeks ago or so, I had requested information about secondary ELA and maths assessments with respect to time of day, like period in the day. The question is there a difference in how well our students do at 7:30 in the morning versus 9:15 in the morning versus 10:30, so on and so forth?
Big. Okay. I'll have to.
I don't know if it was ever logged, but I remember having raising this question.
And I don't recall either.
Okay.
Can you write it up and send it to us
Sure.
again?
Madam President?
Yes.
If I might, if I recall the conversation, I think Dr. Bryant mentioned that there might be some information available from outside of the district that they were going to work to compile, but we might not have anything internally.
Okay. So we can go back and Kelly, submit it again, and I'll go back and look through my notes. And then we'll try to address that. Okay. Any others? Member Donnelly, do you have any other requests? I know you are waiting on we are waiting to get back to you on the book, George.
Thank you, Madam President. I have no additional. Thank you, Madam President. I have no additional requests at this time.
Thank you. Member Wilson, how about you?
I'm fine at this time too. Thank you.
Okay. And Member Holloman, you good? Okay, thank you. All right, thank you. So that brings us to item C, the topic of the year, budget. Dr. Bryant.
Good afternoon, ASD community and board. Tonight we'll be continuing our ongoing budget discussion to address the looming $68+ million deficit. As a reminder to the public, these conversations represent the research phase of the budget development process. Tonight, we'll be reviewing options that will be difficult to hear, such as repurposing school buildings and the pupil-teacher ratio. And our intent continues to be to provide the board the fullest picture possible of our various options, so that way we can pass a balanced budget in the spring. Again, this presentation is intended to be informational and firm recommendations have not been made. And with that, Chief Anderson and team.
Thank you, Dr. Bryant. Slide. So we've shown this slide for a little over a year, briefed it at the legislature and multiple committees last spring, and briefed the board probably 8 or 9 times. The one thing I wanted to point out, just as a reminder, is that the base student allocation from fiscal year 17 through this school year stayed the same. We did have a significant amount of one-time assistance from the state a couple times, fund balance, and federal relief dollars in the last few years. The last thing I'd want to point out that isn't as clear is when you look at FY24, there's still going to be federal relief funds left over that we still have to spend that year. So what that indicates is if the state doesn't inflation proof during the next legislative session, FY25 will continue a path of restructuring to right size in order to be able to perform our mission within the funds we're given. So I know there's a lot of difficult things being brought up and decisions later in the November, December timeframe will be very difficult for the community and the board. But even after we get our budget passed in February, it's very likely, if we look historically, that sometime in the next 3 or 4 months, there may be some additional funding. But if it's not a base student allocation restructure, then we're really back in the same boat July next year.
I appreciate that point, Mr. Anderson. So I just wanted to flash forward to FY25. If we see no change, then an inflation-proof BSA would be something like $860. Would that be the scope of? That's not the BSA itself. The change, right? We would need to see inflation proofing of the BSA.
Well, this is a point in time, right? So we are going to be looking at ESSER funds that were going to be spent this year, that we could conserve those and use them next year, which changes the dynamic on how much is available and would also be impacted by one-time funding if it comes, or a lower base student allocation. So I think it's probably sometime during the session before we could accurately give projections for FY25. Okay. So on the next slide, you'll see the areas from top to bottom that we covered. You'll see some of the items that we covered in the last couple briefings that are now in light gray. Those we are still working on and developing more detailed analysis to come back to the board at a future point in time. When you look at the dark blue underlined, those we'll talk about today at some level, and then of course continue to come back. Pretty good. If you want expectation management, a lot of these will start coming back with the detailed staff estimates and potentially recommendations in the November timeframe, knowing that in December on the last board meeting before Christmas break, we'll be asking the board for decisions and guidance to help us build the budget in the month of January. One thing I do want to point out, we went through a lot of these with principals last week on Wednesday, probably got hundreds and hundreds of comments on 8 different areas from around the district. And it certainly has added numerous other things that we'll be looking at in the next few weeks. And on the next slide, you'll see the areas that we talked about the last couple board meetings. On many of them, I put down, in the October, November timeframe, we'll be coming back with updates for those. And barring any questions, we'll go to the budget deficit slide.
Madam President, just a question for staff. If I know and understand it's still early and you're looking at things, can you share any insight as to what feedback you received from gathering our principals together and what additional items are you considering that aren't on that list?
I'm actually building a slide. We have a spreadsheet now with all of the information. We're pulling it together in order to come back with something that we can prioritize, because some of the things, just due to lack of knowledge, aren't possible because of federal regulations or state laws. And we've got to clean those up before we bring it out. But you will see that in the future. So on this slide, you can see in the upper right, we felt pretty confident that the board was inclined to save the $16 million, at least as a group, 4 or more voters. And I know that we are going to continue the discussion on bond debt reimbursement and major maintenance tonight during the non-action item. There certainly are paths as we start working our way down. When we added the items from last week for Ignite and 6th grade band and orchestra, I just want to point out that these are notional at this time, because some things that we transform won't result in 100% savings, or potentially could result in more savings as the staff completes detailed analysis. Barring any questions, we'll go to this slide. So we have contracted with Shannon Brigham from Western Demographics. We used him several years ago. He's got software that can do live on the fly boundary changes, looking at everything from the type of student needs to a number of other areas. And he's an expert in school closures, helped close Fairbanks, closed 3 schools last year. And he came up before. We ended up not closing any schools and not changing boundaries. But we were certainly had the information to move forward. So I just wanted to do an overview of why across the nation do districts close schools. You can see on the lower left-hand corner some bullets about ASD and our dropping in enrollment and budgets. But really, the discussions on closing schools are about efficiency in the schools. There are some cost savings with our hold harmless factor by year 5. You really don't see those savings anymore, but what you try to focus on is capturing efficiencies in the schools and improving education outcomes. And I'll be handing off to elementary and secondary to talk about the differences they see between really small schools and larger schools.
So at the elementary level, we have smaller schools that have ranges of 8 to 10 to 12 classroom teachers. Oftentimes in those schools, you'll have lower FTE or full-time equivalency of staff in specialized positions. So you might have a specialist teacher who is a 0.2 or a 0.3 FTE, which would be equivalent to a 0.2 would be equivalent to like 1 day of the week, right? And so the smaller schools generally have lower FTE of specialists that's provided to provide the services for POLO programs and things of that nature. You also have student support services and other services that are required that are on a highly itinerant nature by sometimes hard to fill staff. And so at our elementary schools, at the smaller school level, some of those specialized services that are support of the classroom become less efficient because you're distributing them across many small schools versus larger schools. And so there's additional challenges that are embedded within that. So a part of moving students into a larger school setting would be creating stronger efficiencies with additional staffing beyond a classroom teaching experience. So your art content areas, your literacy coaches, your nurses, your specialized occupational therapists, physical therapists, you're eliminating or reducing in those buildings the itinerancy of some of those staff. And by doing that, you're increasing additional efficiencies there at the elementary level.
So for secondary, when you look at master scheduling, it's a very complex puzzle that principals are putting together as a part of the scheduling process. And when you get to smaller sized secondary schools, the complexity that you see there is that often in a small school, as kids get older, the classes become more specialized. And so, for example, if you're in a high level math class, like calculus AB, there are only so many kids in a particular school that reach that level of math. So if you're a small school and only 5 students qualify for that class, then you may not be able to offer it because of the lack of numbers in that particular class. So it doesn't mean that student necessarily doesn't get that course, because we do have online options, but it does create a choice for a school that isn't optimal for the kid. And Additionally, what it creates for students is less elective opportunities because you're trying to fill classes up to their, their potential of seats in that classroom. So with less kids in a school creating a master schedule, you do have to reduce your elective opportunities for kids so that you can fill those courses. The other thing that I would say is a complexity at the secondary level when you get to a certain smaller size is that kids have to often make hard choices within their schedules. And so if you have a student who potentially wants to take a high level world language course, but is also a music student, and both of those courses are only offered once a day, sometimes you have to have students make those hard choices within their schedule. So there's another limitation to the opportunities for kids, right? The other thing I would say that's more similar to elementary in terms of staffing is the smaller the school gets and the more complex the classes get, we rely on specialist teachers. So world languages is a big one that we often look at secondary. When a school gets small, often there's not enough students to fill a full schedule for that teacher. So then we end up sharing that teacher with another smaller school. That compounds the scheduling problem because potentially they're only at one school for the morning session, and that's the only time kids can take it. So there is kind of a sweet spot in master scheduling at the secondary level where you're able to provide enough opportunities so kids have flexibility within their day. You're keeping your teachers full time, so you're not paying for travel time as well for them to go from one school to another. And then getting too small where you're having to do a lot of these fixes and creates complexities for kids in their scheduling.
Yes. What I think I hear is that as our leaders in elementary and secondary, you guys are talking about maybe there are ideal numbers for a school of, I'm picking this out of thin air, 400 students for an elementary school and I don't know, 1,600 students for a high school. I have no idea if that's relevant. But the bullet points here are talking about capacity. So I'm curious about why we haven't talked about capacity, but why is that a reference point if maybe talking about actual numbers of students at a school is more relevant? Sure.
Jim, would you like me to answer that? Yeah, okay. So through the president to member lessons. So I think that's a relevant point that you brought up for sure. When you're looking at low school capacity and low numbers, it's creating those scheduling problems. But if we look at school closures or repurposes and we bring our numbers up within a one building structure, then you have less of those complexities with staffing and master scheduling. So that's where the school closure conversation comes in. So let's fill a middle school up as opposed to having only 400 students in a middle school, because that's where you have those scheduling issues that I described. When you look at a larger middle school of 600 or 700 students, you have a lot more variety in your ability to offer courses for kids. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And to add to that, if you look at right now, we have 18 schools under 65% capacity. It's an indicator that we have at least 18 schools that are much smaller than what the building was designed to do. So we are maintaining more space than we're using. What actually happens in almost every case in any world is that people actually expand out into those spaces and fill them. But now we're maintaining everything from duct cleaning to lights for areas of a school that otherwise wouldn't be used. So you increase costs, but it is more about knowing that we have 18 that are under 65 means we also have 18 schools that are much smaller than what the buildings were designed to support. And then everything Kirsten and Eric talked about, it's really happening in our schools every day. The combo classes, when we're short, really low density specialists in the OT, PT world or related services, we're spreading them out over to lots of smaller schools instead of being able to maybe keep them in one place at a larger school where they can serve more students than driving around. So it really is more about efficiency. Mr. Donnelly was correct in the last meeting. For an generic elementary school, you save about $800,000+ in staff the first couple of years. Add a couple bus routes or more, depending on the school. You're really saving a little over $500,000 per school. But what we're creating is a better education environment for students, while also saving, and it really does, it expands that timeline that the legislature has to work with to right-size education funding. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. But we do focus on efficiency more than the cost savings. But frankly, $500,000, we're going to be looking at a lot of things that are less than $500,000 for cost savings over the next couple months.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a follow-up, Member Lessons? Okay. All right, continue. We're good.
Okay, so that's a good segue into the next one. When we start talking about efficiencies of the teaching staff, there's also efficiencies in the just normal or the metrics-based school staff. And that's predominantly as a factor is the way we have this lined out. So this slide really does show what our metrics-based standards are. So you'll see like elementary schools, there's a lot of them that we have as a 1 or 2 per school. And it doesn't matter if it's a school of 600 or a school of 200, we're going to have 1 librarian, 1 nurse, 2 office admin, and a BPO at the elementary school. The kindergarten TIs, that's based on the number of classrooms. We have a 3.5-hour TA in each one. Once we get into middle and high schools, though, we have more of a per student metric on there. For principals, 400 to 1, counselors, 300 to 1. But there are also some just school-wide, like 1 librarian at each one. 1 nurse, same though. As we've seen in recent years, we've had some lower, as enrollment trended lower with the pandemic, we held a lot of these metrics harmless. So you'll see a lot of schools that are outside of the metric, and some of it was that way before the pandemic, but it's the loss of students in secondary has really exacerbated that. And part of it's like if you look at a middle school with 400 kids versus a middle school with 600 kids, a principal, that might trigger 1 principal or 2, but we're going to have a minimum standard of 2 at middle schools just because that's the programmatic need with all the sports and activities that are going on. But we're going to be assessing these standards and making sure that our schools fit with this, and if they were really developed in order to be able to adjust these up or down when funding comes tight.
And this is a good segue into Member Jacobs' question earlier. A lot of the principals did mention for very small schools, do they really need a full librarian or a full nurse, or could they rotate between schools? Or is there another way to do it, including outsourcing if there was really small to some of their local library? The principal comments, I mean, it was hundreds and hundreds of them, but you did ask for an example. I thought this would be a good slide to bring it up.
Thank you. And we did hold a lot of the school. Again, we helped schools harmless, a lot of it because of behavior-related issues, kids coming back from the pandemic. We didn't want to cut counselors in the middle of the pandemic, things like that. So there was a lot of reasons for holding those harmless. The next slide is our just an overview of our ASD virtual. We spent about $5.4 million last year on virtual instruction just through the ASDV. Predominantly that money was in the grant and within summer school, and that summer school is for July of 2021 and June of 2022. So there's 2 sessions of virtual instruction that were included in that. And then in the general fund, we also have about 1.9 million or so that we budget and pay out for virtual instruction. And this used to be called iSchool, and it used to be focused, or a lot of it still is focused on credit recovery type activities. But we had a much smaller scope of virtual prior to the pandemic, but it really became more necessary. So we'll be looking at ways to transform that, since we have had a significant decline in the population of students that are taking those virtual courses.
All right, barring no questions, I'm going to shift us to middle school model. One of the things that we're evaluating is that particular model. Currently, we have high school teachers teaching 5 of 6 periods a day with 1 planning period. And then we have middle school teachers teaching 5 of 7 periods a day with 1 collaboration team period. So middle school students are taking 7 classes a day, and high school students are taking 6 classes a day. In order to really understand middle school model, some of you were on the board and some of you weren't back in the fall of 2018. But just to understand where we got in terms of collaboration time in middle school today, I think you need to understand that history. Team time in our school district prior to 2018 was widely used. There was a shift in the 2 previous schools years to different scheduling options. That ended up in negotiations with AEA, and out of the 2018 negotiations with AEA, there was an ask through negotiations to potentially look at bringing that time back. So rather than it being embedded in the contract, an MOA was developed with AEA for a middle school committee, essentially, which I was in charge of at the time, and ran in collaboration with AEA members. So there was lots of representation on that committee from all walks in our district: principals, district leaders, teachers. And out of that came a recommendation for what you have today in our middle schools, which is collaboration time. And that was approved by the board at the time through raising PTR through the budget process to accommodate for that extra collaboration time period that teachers are now engaged in. So we went through a really robust process with our middle schools about what is involved in that collaboration time that they engage in. And the focus is really on powerful instruction, positive relationships, and collaboration with our professionals in our middle schools. And so they meet daily to discuss different student concerns, meet with parents, goal set with students. They have professional meetings as well to talk about how to help students who are struggling. There are lots of great things that are happening during that time. However, it does come at a cost to our district, and so that's why we're evaluating it. And so you'll see the last bullet there is if we do change that model to not incorporating that period during the day of collaboration time, it does save $2.9 million for the school district. So we are looking at that time. But I think for the board to really evaluate that model, it's important to know all of that history that goes along with it as well.
And just to add to this, like many things when you develop a budget, there's other things linked to decisions. So if you wanted to reduce 6th grade band and orchestra, your choice would be to eliminate the program but keep 6th graders there. And then all the 6th graders in middle school, when the elementary now moved to middle school in 7th grade, would be a year behind. So it was for equity reasons that 6th grade band and orchestra has continued. But there are a lot of other reasons why a move from 6th grade to middle school district-wide would occur on the instructional side, which we'll talk about in future meetings. But it also, if you move 6th grade to middle school, you save the $2.5 million for 6th grade band and orchestra. Some of those would end up being music teachers in middle school because now there's more classes, but you would still save a significant portion of that. But if you move 6th grade to middle school and you don't change the middle school model, we're going to significantly increase costs for 1/12 of our students in the district, going from 5 planning periods per week to 10. And so they really are linked with each other in the decision. You can look at band and orchestra separate and unique from 6th grade move to middle school. You can also look at middle school model as unique from 6th grade to middle school. But if you do that, then you're going to end up increasing your overall costs at the end of the day. And later on, we'll show something as we get a little farther on that shows the links and the decisions between, if there's one really tough decision that people don't want to make, the impacts on not being able to make that decision are also going to impact a lot of other things that the district is bringing in front of you, because it's just, there's so many things tied to each other. Slide, please.
Looks like we're good.
Great, thank you. So this slide shows our PTR, our pupil teacher ratios, what they are currently, and kind of giving you a high level overview of what the savings are if we were to have to increase that. Again, as Dr. Bryant mentioned, this is certainly not a recommendation, just to give you guys a scope of what the savings or the reductions are available if we increase PTR. So right now, we started in kindergarten about 21 as what we budget on, up to 30.25 for high schools. And in FY, and this is inclusive of the teachers that we put in the ESSER fund for this year to shore up the FY23 budget, which was about a 10 PTR increase into the ESSER, the ARP grant. So if we were to increase at 5 PTR, that's about 273 staff and about $32 million of funds saved. Certainly it's not ideal, but roughly equivalent to the amount that we are in the proposed substitute memo for 24 for the spending plan or the bond debt reimbursement, about the same amount that we've proposed as unallocated. But again, not a recommendation, just kind of pointing out this is the amount of money that it would save if we were to increase PTR. And really, the higher you go up on the PTR, you have diminishing returns on how much money is saved. So one PTR increase, maybe that's $7.5 million, but you get less and less for each additional per kid you put in each class.
No questions? Yes.
So with respect to,
we have one before you start.
Oh.
Remember lessons.
I reached out to Andy before we went live because I saw the printout, and I just wanted to relay the questions so all other board members could hear. But just to underscore that even if we did increase the PTR by 5 for next year, we would have the exact same problem the following year. So that $32 million is a one and done proposition in that sense.
If we were to use the 32 million to not increase the PTR by 5, then it's kicking the can down the road. If we do actually increase the PTR and cut the positions, and they're permanent reductions unless we get money going forward. Sorry, I don't know if I made that clear.
I think it's really as a board, and I know you're going to be talking about legislative priorities. Heather Breaks is coming up this week. It's really, do you think that a legislative session can get all the way through to a BSA increase on the first year of a 2-year session? And sometimes it's just a gamble on whether you kick the can down the road to give them time and space. And frankly, after all the public discussions this year, to give the community time and space to make sure legislators understand their priorities that might be more than just one item for the state's budget. So sometimes kicking the can down the road is just buying space and time. And that's what we've done with one-time funding. But hopefully during this year of budget build, our community will understand that ultimately, if there isn't a BSA fix, every year will look like this year at some level.
Okay. Other questions? All right. Deb.
so review of district-wide insurance is something that we obviously do every year as we go through our renewal in the spring. I think it's important to take a look quickly when you look at the increase in both property insurance and casualty insurance. It's striking and a little bit alarming. Just to kind of give you the background on what that looks like. So with respect to the general liability or casualty, the market share and capacity for school districts across the nation, not ASD singled out, has diminished for 3 primary reasons. The spike in sexual abuse, molestation, misconduct, and traumatic brain injury claims, as well as adverse claims experience that has caused the pool of potential insurers to literally dry up. We used to have a pool of 27. This year, our pool was down to 9. The third reason is the complexities of school district exposures has grown exponentially as we have creative litigators expanding theories of liability. With respect to the property or our buildings and facilities, the increases are can be attributed to the spike in large weather-related loss events, the hurricanes, flooding, wildfire destruction, combined with low interest rates, the wide increases in the number of their liability losses due to a lot of the natural catastrophes that have gone on. And lastly, the pandemic, which has really resulted in economic uncertainty for those insurers. These trends for adverse liability claims and property claims have caused, as I said, major insurance carriers rethink their strategies on insuring school districts and municipalities, because as you know, we go to market with the municipality of Anchorage. So what we're doing is as we do every year, but this year I'm working with the municipality as well. We're reviewing the excess general liability coverage limits, how much we're carrying in insurance, looking at the potential of perhaps increasing our SIR, which is the deductible on each of those different platforms of insurance, but then weighing that or assessing it against the risk exposures that we are opening ourselves up to if we look at either of those options.
And to put it in perspective, just a few years ago, we were able to get almost all of our insureds locked up by April or so, knowing that it ran out at the end of June. But the last 2 straight years, it was all the way up to the final hour before we could get insurers to lock in rates and even pick us up. So insurance for school districts around the nation is getting more difficult to get. And it's taking much longer because so many have just dropped out of our market. So as we look at these, we talk about looking at our risk and liability. You can look at something, and we will be going through all of these, but it really is determining if there was something like Uvalde or something like that, would $100,000 be worth the risk of tens of millions? And so it's going to be pretty time consuming as we try to capture where we think we stand, and on this we'll come back with a recommendation.
And particularly with respect to, if you look at the insurance programs there, cyber this year, we had to buy it 1 month at a time. Putting that insurance in place was nearly impossible. And thanks to Mike Fleckenstein and Jack Johnson, who worked night and day, we were able to put it into place, but at a significant increase. But as you probably have all heard, LA Unified was just hacked. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that insurance in place, the loss is millions and millions of dollars. So,
yes. Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam President. With the last second nature, for at least the last 2 years of who we're utilizing for insurance, will you be able to give us a recommendation before the end of this year as we're developing the budget process through February, or is that something that's going to be in flux through at the end of the fiscal year?
It is part of the budget. And so it will be in flux a little bit because we don't start that process until after the first of the year. But each year I work with Andy and Jim and our broker to really estimate the best, based on our conversations with our broker on what to expect for premium increase. Cyber took us by surprise, but not really.
And just to point out, we spend about $3 million a year in insurance. So it's not the hugest portion of our expenses, but it's incredibly time consuming. But I think it's been about a 12% to 15% average increase over the last several years. Most of that in liability. So if there's no other questions as we go to the calendar, this is the last school board meeting, not the joint school board meeting, but the last school board meeting in September. And as you look down, we did post the survey right after the last board meeting. And within a week, we already had over 900 responses. We will pull that survey at the end of September and quickly try to summarize and post on the same webpage the results of the survey. And we did have a smattering mix of community, that's not directly with a child in the school system, with staff and faculty in the school system, and also some students. So I think the survey, it certainly was well received. We put it out in 5 languages. I will say that at the end of the first week, by far the predominant language was English that was used. And there were only 2 other languages with surveys, but I haven't checked in the past week. But we'll give all those results to you early October, and I think it was successful. We will also start planning as a staff for town halls late October through November, potentially in December. Some of those town halls will focus on potential school closures and mergings with the community. And of course, there will be a couple as well on the budget. And as we get dates for those, and we're farther along into identifying which schools are possible candidates for closure and repurpose, then we'll start locking in those with the communities. As you look in October, Shannon will be here on the 4th of October, giving a general overview of all of the things that he's going to look at. For those of you who were here in the past, his software and his systems have a lot of capacity and capability that we just don't have internally. And we'll be looking at boundary changes that impact not just school closures, but other important groups within the district that we need to make sure that we address. And we've heard one small community that was discussed at school board meetings last month or earlier this month. So we'll be looking really district-wide. Slide, please. As we look into November, by November, of course, we will have October's survey results, and we'll be putting out a November survey result that's much more focused on those items we brought up associated with school closures and detailed staff analysis that we had available at the time. And then we had the legislative luncheon on December 2nd. So we'll be starting preparation for that in November with the board president and the governance committee. And those are both big, heavy lifts. Slide, please. So if you look at the final, well, not the final slide. You wish it was the final slide, but almost. So we know that we'll be making future discussions in the upper right, or future decisions on the upper right. Some of those we'll be bringing to you after we have finished our staff analysis and ask for decisions so we can start putting them in buckets, because you certainly don't want to wait till 20 December and start deciding on all of them all at once. We'll try to bring them in after we're comfortable that the board has all the information they need, and it doesn't lock you in any case. It just helps us put it in a bucket for budget development in January. But naturally, school closures at some point before the end of December, we will ask the board to make a decision, because you simply can't build 5 different budgets or 6 different budgets, depending on what the board may decide on any one school, because it'll impact the entire rest of the budget. So I would key in on that timeline, and those things like 6th grade moves to middle school, which changes funding for every single school in the district. There are some big things that we really will need to know how the board feels. And I think that will set the community up for expectation management in February when the budget comes out, because the last thing after spending 6 months of an incredibly public budget drill would be to surprise anybody, the board or the community. So I just wanted to let you know what December is going to look like and expectations. And with that, I will go to the final slide. And these are topics for future discussion. One of our biggest, I'll let Mike Fleckenstein talk.
It's just a quick preview of something you'll see sort of mid-October. I've been working with a group of folks from our project management office. And I should have mentioned, I'm Mike Fleckenstein, Chief Information Officer for the school district. And what we're doing is looking at really strategically sunsetting things that are no longer adding value in the district. And so this is a process that's going to be ongoing, not just for this budget cycle, but it was a great time to start it. And so what we're doing is we're using this as an opportunity to create all of the processes that we use to evaluate different both programs and devices and software, things like that, so that we can objectively decide, is this thing, whatever this thing is, still adding value to the district, adding value to students, and is it worth what we're paying for? And so the goal would be, hopefully, as we implement things, that we know what success looks like, and we know when we want to spin those down. And so the first thing we're looking at here is software. So the district invests millions of dollars in software. And over the pandemic, one of the things that we saw was that many vendors decided to go into the same space because that space was needed at the time, whether it be video conferencing, remote collaboration tools, remote access tools, those sorts of things. And so many of our vendors actually now supply those same pieces of functionality. And before, we were only using them for whatever their primary functionality was. Now there's overlap, and we're paying for more than one. So we're looking at usage of those pieces of software, total cost of the software. And then this committee, which is made up of folks from across the district, then rates these things as sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 5 being kind of low-hanging fruit. Not a lot of people are using this. It's not adding a lot of value. That's something that we should put on the list of cuts for this round. And then the way it would work is if we cut, then we would be able to notice in the second half of the school year, so that anybody that is still using that particular piece of software could make the transition over to like software, or find a replacement for that thing that software was filling the hole on. And so that team is working on that right now. They're putting the metrics together around that, total cost over time, and then recommendations as to where we might cut. And so in October, we hope to come back to you with some of that information, both on the software side and on the hardware side. When we talk about things like one-to-one, there's a secondary group working the one-to-one right now as well, as to what do we want that to look like across the district and what can we afford. So this is just a preview, and I look forward to speaking with you sort of mid-October on both of those things. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to add to that, ultimately, we see the sunset plan expanding as part of Project Management Office for all those other things that were added to the district. And some of them, many of them, were added as a result of having grant funds to be able to do something. But then when the grant funds went away, it's still important, but there's a lot of things that are still important, but now there's not a funding source for those things. So working with Dr. Akes and his assessment team, looking at things from the student outcomes perspective, from the cost and financial modeling perspectives, and then risk, especially on software. It's not just LA Unified. I think it was like almost a third of the country school districts got hacked last year. So, it might be that anything that has any level of risk, we just off-ramp it in order to make sure that we secure what we need to operate every day. So this committee is certainly focused on software, but it's going to expand to many other areas. We won't, as a staff, as a board, as a district, find every possible way to create efficiencies in the next 2.5 months. Now that we've started this process, most of us understand it's going to continue certainly into FY25. But the beauty of it is it's now going to be a normal process where we're constantly looking for efficiencies and innovations and a different way to do it. And it's more structured as we bring Mike's PMO team and the Sunset Committee, because all of them are 18 players, and they're really setting that structure in place to be able to spread that across other areas in the district. So, and the rest of them you can see, and we'll talk in depth in multiple board meetings in the future.
I grunted a lot during the presentation, but that was just to say thank you. And I don't know, it's just almost depressing, but we'll get through it. Thank you. Thank all of you. Questions? Member Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam President. So this is something I've talked with Dr. Bryan about a couple of times, but I think in our last joint meeting, we engaged with the Assembly, and there was interest in the municipality at least hearing from the district as to what it might look like to assist us with transportation funding, knowing we haven't seen a significant increase since 2017, knowing it's a way for them to assist us outside of the BSA. Are we actively preparing a proposal of some kind to present to them prior to their budget season, which is quickly approaching?
Yes. To be clear, transportation funding, the last time they updated it at $481 per student was 2016. And there have been a couple times in the past 5 years that there was still money within the cap that was transferred to cover transportation shortfalls. It just didn't happen for this budget. But we can certainly talk that. I think Andy can talk projected transportation deficits, at least before we sign the contract. And then obviously we'll have to redo that. Okay, I won't put him on the spot like that next time. That was probably a little bit inappropriate.
But he's still cool and calm there.
But he's Andy. Are there any other questions while he's...
I didn't really want to tell you something that's not accurate. So,
Member Holland, yes.
This has kind of come up as a question from community members, and I'll understand that it's not something that can be answered off the top of your head. But yeah, we went from 50,000 to 45,000. And obviously that's not a BSA issue. That's having to cut back because of loss of revenue from students that aren't there anymore. Are you able to say what percentage of our issue relates to that? I mean, obviously we cut instruction staff some. That doesn't make up for the shortfall 100%.
Well, we've kept the same infrastructure, so we still have all the staffing at multiple schools that maybe we could conserve those resources. That's part of it. During the pandemic, we lost a significant number of intensive needs students, which is a relatively large chunk at 13 times the multiplier for each, although those numbers are growing again. And I'm not talking about them as if they're equal to a dollar amount, but I think a lot of the families and the students either were uncomfortable or for medical reasons couldn't come back to the district. So it's a positive thing in terms of they're coming back so we can now serve them. And with that just happens to come with some additional revenue as well. And I think Andy has your answer now.
yeah, as far as the transportation goes, the city operates under a tax, a tax cap. And then the district will calculate its own tax cap within that, although it's not necessarily legally required. So within that tax cap, though, we did have authority, and we requested $5.6 million in property taxes to help shore up the transportation fund for the current year. We were below the district calculated cap in the general fund, so we requested additional to shore that fund up. And the community's been and the assembly's been really supportive of providing those funds. So that's been really beneficial for us.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, seeing none, can't believe we're early. But I'd like to thank the staff for all of the information, your hard work. It's a lot, and I really appreciate the process. So board members, we will, I'll entertain a motion to move into executive session for legal negotiations contracts.
Madam President, so moved. Second.
Okay. Moved in second. Thank you. We are now in executive session. Any opposition? Seeing no opposition, we're in executive session.